biggest shock in the international monetary system since 1971. They're going to unveil a new currency. So they've cloned the World Bank. They've cloned the IMF. This is half the world or more in terms of population, resources, military capacity, land mass, and wealth. This will start to look like the European monetary zone. This will start to look like the euros. It's going to be linked to gold. The whole idea is to get out from under the dollar, and I warned them all. Sanctions work. The dollar's powerful. You get it. You're using it against Iran, but you're overusing it. You're over-applying it. At some point, people are going to get out of the dollar system. It's like, how many times can you hit the punching bag before the punching bag walks away? Well, that's what's happening now. We've gone too far with Russia, with Ukraine, and they're walking away from the dollar. The Fed, Bank of England, the G7 finance ministers, they don't see this coming. I warned the Treasury and the Pentagon about it 10 years ago, and they're like, thank you, Jim, and ignored it. But what happens next? It's going to get worse. Every single goal or metric that the U.S. set has not come true for the Russians and has come true for the U.S. We're the ones being depleted. We're the ones spending the money. We're the ones failing. I just see people who are delusional, who don't understand the economic side of war, think you can push a button and get weapons and you can't, think money's unlimited and it's not. And that's who's running U.S. policy.
I've watched interviews with both RFK and Trump who said they will end the war immediately. Like one phone call, it's over in a week.
You could have stopped it with a phone call, so it never should have started.
Are we already in a global recession?
Probably yes. There's a major credit contraction. There's a collateral shortage, a dollar shortage. That's not a recipe for a recession. I don't know what it is.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs, sharing our vulnerability, overcoming our fears, transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is...
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Jim Rickards, the American lawyer and investment banker turned economist, thought leader, and author. You have over 35 years of experience working in the capital markets on Wall Street while also acting as an advisor to the CIA and the Pentagon. You topped the New York Times bestseller list with titles including The Death of Money, Currency Wars, and your most recent book, Sold Out, which explained how the broken supply chain and surging inflation will have catastrophic consequences on the global economy. You are known as the man who predicted the biggest financial crisis in American history, and right now, you believe we are facing an economic collapse far worse than that of 2008. One that will lead to a major upheaval of the international monetary system and the dollar losing its status as the global reserve currency. Jim, welcome back to London Real.
Thank you, Brian. Great to be with you.
Always great to have you back. Before we get started, I just want to alert everyone to an important video that you've just recorded that will not be available to the public. Here, you discuss the upcoming geopolitical shockwave of what you call the most significant development in international finance since 1971. But then you explain how anyone can position themselves to profit from this crisis. Our viewers can access that video at londonreal.tv/Jim, and I highly recommend that everyone go watch that immediately after our conversation. Jim, let's get into it. I'm increasingly concerned about a recession in the US and here in the UK, with our house prices falling for the first time in 11 years, and people are now predicting it to go down a shocking 10% in housing prices. Jim, are we already in a global recession?
That's a great question, Brian. The answer is probably yes. We never know for sure until after the fact, because you're in it, you got to wait for the data. Then in the United States, I mean, they're not the global arbiter, but in the United States, we have something called the National Bureau of Economic Research. It's based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It's not a government agency. It's a private group of about 12 prominent economists, egghead types. And they're the ones who declare when the recession began and when it ended. But they're usually, it's like a year after the fact. It's like, maybe in the middle of next year, they'll say, recession started in the first quarter of 2023. Like, thank you, we knew that. But it's usually over before they declare it. So I'm not waiting for the official arbiter. I look at a lot of other indicators, and they're almost uniformly bad. And they have very good track records of getting the predictions right. Not unlike the Fed, which is always wrong, always late. So without getting too technical, the Fed's looking at unemployment. And it's based on the so-called Phillips curve. It says, unemployment's down, inflation's up. If unemployment's up, inflation's down. That's the Phillips curve. You can draw it, and the Fed's using that to guide policy. The Phillips curve is garbage, and it's not a personal insult against Professor Phillips. It's the case that there's no empirical support for it. I could give you examples going back to the 1930s of low unemployment, low inflation, which we had in the early 60s. 1930s, we had high unemployment, low inflation, even deflation. Late 1970s, what did we have? High unemployment and high inflation. That was called stagflation. So I can give you examples. If you think of it as a quad chart, unemployment, inflation, fill in the blanks. I could give you all four examples: low, 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 high, high, low, high, high, which means there's no correlation. If you can have any one of them, there's no correlation. So the Phillips curve has no predictive value on its face because the data doesn't back it up. Last time I looked at a Phillips curve, it was a flat line. At least where I went to school, curves were not flat, but there it is. Now, it's worse than that because unemployment, even if you thought it was a good indicator of something, particularly inflation, it's a lagging indicator or a lagging indicator of recession, as the case may be. So let's say you're an employer, a business person. I mean, you're an entrepreneur. I start businesses. When you're in a tough spot, when revenues are down and things are slowing down, margins are getting compressed and all that, the last thing you want to do is fire people because it took a while to find them, hire them, train them. You don't want to let them go. You do everything else. Like you turn down the lights, you call your landlord, negotiate a cheaper rent, slow pay your creditors, drive a hard bargain on something. You do everything else to maintain your margins. And then only when all else fails do you start firing people. So first of all, it's a lagging indicator. You're already in the recession before you get around to firing people, number one. Number two, because you held on so long, you tend to do it en masse. It's not like, well, I'm going to fire one person a month for the next year. It's like, I'm going to hang on to all of them and then maybe, sadly, fire them all at once because I have no other choice. So A, it's a lagging indicator. B, it can turn on a dime from very low unemployment to very high unemployment within a matter of months. And if that's what the Fed's relying on, which they are, they say so. It's not a guess. They say that's what we're watching. Two things. Number one, you're not going to see the recession coming. It's a lagging indicator, and it can go from kind of good to bad almost overnight. So the Fed's, driving this way, looking out the back window, and they're probably going to wreck the economy. But there are a lot of other signs to say, okay, Jim, unemployment's not a good measure, and it isn't. But how do you know what are the good metrics? They tend to be a little technical. They tend to be things that very few people look at, but they're there. They're not secret. The big one, I think this gets more notice, is an inverted Treasury yield curve. Well, what does that mean? So a normal yield curve, it's like the longer the maturity, the higher the rate. That's common sense. So if I'm going to lend somebody money for a month, I might charge a certain interest rate. But if I'm going to lend you money for 10 years, I want a much higher interest rate because there's a lot more risk, inflation, default, credit risk, who knows what. So a normal yield curve is upward sloping. The longer the maturity, the higher the rate. Okay, right now, yield curves are inverted, which means they're downward sloping, which means the longer the maturity, the lower the rate. Why would you take a lower rate on a 10-year Treasury note than you would on an overnight loan, that's where we are today, by the way. The overnight rate is over 5, and the 10-year rate's 3.6, give or take. Well, why would you take a lower rate for a longer term loan? It makes no sense. Well, it makes no sense unless you think the bottom is falling out of the economy. Because if I buy a 10-year note with a 3.7% yield to maturity, which I could do today, that seems low compared to the 5% for the overnight rate, but that might look really good a year from now. If interest rates are 1%, if the 10-year note is 1%, that 3.7% rate is going to look really sweet. It's like, hey, I got to get a very high return. So in other words, this is the big money. This is the institutional money. This is people who know more than central bankers in many cases. betting that interest rates are going to come down a lot, because if they weren't, that inverted yield curve would make no sense. And so they're betting that the economy is going into a severe recession. Interest rates are going to drop, and those 3.7% yields are going to look really good. Now, just to get a little more arcane, there's something called the SOFR futures curve. SOFR is the new LIBOR. There were problems with LIBOR, but these are long-term bets on overnight rates. Treasury is a snapshot of what I think the 10-year rate is going to be, but the SOFR is the opposite. They trade in strips, quarterly settlements that go out 3 or 4 years, 5 years, but the longer ones aren't that liquid. But basically, I can make a bet as to what I think the overnight rate is going to be 1 year from today. That yield curve is also steeply inverted. And again, this is the real, who trades SOFR futures? Well, the institutions and central banks and the big money, in other words. And it's in the data. It's not a guessing. You can look at it. It's publicly available. And it says rates are going to drop steeply in the months and year ahead. So again, these are, when you have an inverted SOFR yield curve, an inverted Treasury yield curve, it's basically the big money betting the rates are going to drop like a stone. Well, why would that be? Well, there are only two reasons. One, a severe recession and a steep drop in inflation. And those two things do go together. One more example, again, I don't want to get too in the weeds, but there's something, the Fed has an overnight reverse repo facility. What does that mean? So the Fed says, hey, send me give me your cash, and I'll give you a treasury bill as collateral, and then we'll unwind it at some point in the future. It's called a reverse repo. So I can call up the Fed, have them send me treasury bills as collateral, give them cash, and they'll pay me interest on that. It's a phone call. I don't have to do anything fancy. Okay. But the Treasury also sells treasury bills at auction, and I can bid on them, and people do. And the yield to maturity on those is lower than the Fed will give you for a phone call. So why would you bid at an auction, take the market risk and get a yield that's lower than the one you can get for a phone call? Well, the answer is that the treasury bill that they send me when I do the treasury facility, I cannot rehypothecate it, meaning I have to hold it, give it back to the Fed when they want it, but I can't give it to you or anybody else. Whereas if I bid at auction, I can take that bill, I can pledge it to UBS, UBS can pledge it to Deutsche Bank can pledge it to Barclays, and they do. So, but the reason I bid more aggressively for that and take a lower yield, I'm fighting for a lower yield instead of the higher yield I can get for free, is because I need the collateral. That's a sign that there's a collateral shortage, that banks are reducing their balance sheets, they're unwinding derivatives, et cetera. So sorry to be a little technical, Brian, but the point is when you look at two inverted yield curves and an auction rate that's lower than what you can get for a phone call, they all say the same thing. Rates are going down, the economy is going to crash, and there's collateral scarcity, and banks are tightening up their balance sheets. So they're all bad signs.
Yeah, when I got to Bankers Trust in 1993, I got thrown right on the swap book, and I soon learned about the mercantile exchange with the LIBOR futures, and we would trade them all the way out to what we called the reds and the blacks. So that was 9 years, 10 years out of these forward 3-month rates. So it's actually right there to see. You don't need to do bond math, subtract the 10-year rate from the 7-year rate to see those forward yields. It's actually right there in black and white where you can see the forward 3-month rates, and it kind of spells out what the market is telling you those forward rates are going to be, and it's right there. And like you said, that's the institutional money betting, and that money is usually righter than the Fed, right? And the government.
Correct. And by the way, you mentioned swaps and derivatives. It reminds me of another indicator. Just quickly, swap rates are we have negative swap rates. What does that mean? Well, what is a swap? So I buy a 10-year Treasury note, and I finance it in the overnight market. So what's happening to me? I'm getting the yield on the 10-year Treasury note, and I'm paying an overnight yield. So I'm receiving fixed, paying floating. Well, sometime in the 80s, but certainly, in your experience in the 90s, in my experience, at some point somebody said, hey, why don't we get rid of the bond? Like, just pay fixed and receive floating. Who needs the bond? The bond's a piece of collateral, but we can have a contract. So that's a swap, a simple form of swap. So I do a swap with Deutsche Bank, and Deutsche Bank says, okay, Jim, I'll pay you the 10-year rate. You pay me the overnight rate. It's exactly the same as if you had the note and we're financing it in the repo market. It's just receive fixed, pay floating. That's a swap. Pardon me. But if you think of the credit risk, oh, at least with the 10-year Treasury note, I got the United States government behind me. If I'm doing a swap with, UBS, I got bank risk. I've got some credit risk in the bank. Credit Suisse just failed. So it's logical. It makes sense that the rate I get from UBS should be slightly higher than the Treasury rate. The swap rate from a bank should be slightly higher than the comparable maturity of a government security, because the government security is slightly safer than a big bank. Well, right now, that's not true. UBS, or, I don't pick on UBS, Barclays, anybody else in a swap, the rate I get is lower than I get from a 10-year Treasury note. So why would I do that? Why would I take the poorer credit and take a lower rate instead of a higher rate? Well, the answer is the swap is off balance sheet, and the Treasury note, if I own it, I got to put it on my balance sheet. So when you see negative swap rates, meaning the riskier credit is paying you less than the government credit, what it means is that the balance sheets are constrained. I got to do the off balance sheet trade because we can't use up the balance sheets. That's consistent with what we just talked about with the inverted yield curves, which is there's a major credit contraction. There's a collateral shortage, a dollar shortage, and a credit contraction. That's not a recipe for a recession. I don't know what it is.
Wow, this is powerful stuff. And what I love it, Jim, is when you and I start talking like this, a lot of the audience, they understand more than I always think they will. They kind of get it. So many people now are way up the curve on this stuff. And again, these things are right there if you know what to look for. You've also just recorded this video that will not be available to the public. You're going to talk about this upcoming geopolitical shockwave of what you call the most significant development in international finance since 1971. But then you also explain how anyone can position themselves to profit on this crisis. People can access that at londonreal.tv/Jim. Again, highly recommend people check that out when we're done. What's next, Jim? You've pointed the finger, I think, at the Biden administration for a lot of this recession. You have said that the president has drained our oil reserves more than any president in history. Obviously, this is ongoing war in Ukraine. How much of this is the president's fault? How much of it is its supply chain? And where are we currently at now? What are we, about 17 months before an election?
Right. It's a great list, Brian, because you can say, well, we could talk about the war in Ukraine. Yeah, we could talk about monetary policy. We just kind of did, go through some of the recession indicators. We can talk about the election, but they're all connected. I mean, that's really where the complexity theory and the density of the network comes in, because these things are all connected. So just to spend a minute on Ukraine. By the way, I just last week conducted I do this annually, so it's been 8 years in a row, conducted a seminar on financial warfare at the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And it is at the Army War College, but there are people there from all branches. It's a very elite group, handpicked, about 12 students, mid-career officers, so they're kind of late 30s, early 40s, lieutenant colonels, and from all branches. So I get Marines, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and a few civilians, State Department, and CIA, NSA, intelligence community. But it's a fun group, 12, 13. I look at the resumes, amazingly accomplished. They all have multiple master's degrees, the occasional PhD, speak 4 languages, been deployed from Iraq to, Colombia or wherever. But they've been handpicked as the future big brains. These are people 5 years from now, there'll be 3-star generals on the National Security Council, et cetera. So it's a fun class. And my topic is financial warfare, which is kind of like finance and warfare, which is what we're mashing up right now. But and I spent a lot of time talking about this whole BRICS thing, and we can talk about that if you like.
Yeah.
But I tell in interviews like this, Brian, I always explain. I said, I didn't say anything in the U.S. Army War College that I'm not saying in this interview. It's not like I have a secret package for them and we do something else. So I just say the same thing. You can take it or leave it. You can agree or disagree. But it's a great group, very interactive. But I was talking about the Ukraine war, and I said, one of the most difficult things about this is getting reliable information. I said, in a war, everybody lies, so the U.S. lies. If you ask me what has surprised me about the war, the conduct of the war, the development hasn't really been a surprise. Russia was always going to win, just a question of how long, and it's tragic. But I'm surprised at how many warmongers there are in the UK. I'm not, France is in, they're mushy. Germany's between a rock and a hard place. Hungary is actually against the war. Italy, again, a little mushy. But, and the the US has the warmongers. I know that. But starting with Boris Johnson and going to Rishi Sunak, I mean, they're more bloodthirsty than the Americans, and they're the ones providing the Challenger tanks, et cetera. I don't quite get it. I think all these Chamberlain, Churchill, Hitler metaphors fall down. I mean, I know history. I know what Chamberlain did, and I know, Winston Churchill was one of the great heroes of the 20th century. But I don't see that parallel. I don't see.
Are they doing it to try to get a better trade deal with the U.S.? Is it that simple or no?
Well, it disappoints me to see the UK act as kind of lackeys of the US. I mean, it's sad to see. I mean, it's not the heyday of the British Empire, but it's one of the largest economies in the world, major financial center, nuclear power. I mean, it's not like it's a tertiary power, but I see what's going on, but I have to say, I don't understand it. I don't see why the UK can't go their own way a little bit, but they are, so they're not. But not to get too immersed in the politics, you can pretty much lay the entire Ukrainian tragedy at Biden's feet, because Russia would not have invaded Ukraine in February of 2022 if they hadn't been provoked for 14 years. I mean, going back to 2008. So what happened in 2008? George W. Bush stands up at a NATO summit and says, Georgia and Ukraine should join NATO. He just said that. Three months later, Putin invades Georgia.
Yeah, during the Olympics, right? During the Olympics, I think, right?
Yeah, well, that's right, 2008 Olympics. So Bush says Georgia and Ukraine should join NATO. Putin almost immediately invades Georgia and takes the place over. It's like, were you not paying attention? Did you not get the message? And we had the global financial crisis and a lot else. So fast forward to 2014, what happens? They have an election in Ukraine. A pro-Russia, pro-Putin president wins. You can debate, election, how high quality was the election. You can say, I don't like the guy, but he won. There actually was an election. And within months, the MI6 and CIA, working with neo-Nazi elements in Ukraine, and they've been there since the Second World War, overthrow the guy. They basically, they had the Maidan Square color revolution, so-called, which is all orchestrated by the intelligence agencies. They got snipers, they're killing people. The anti-Russian Ukrainians were doing the killing. And then the guy flees for his life, goes to Russia, and the U.S. installs a puppet.
And wasn't Soros funding Vice to go there and cover it in the central square? And
correct. Yeah, and Victoria Nuland's behind the whole thing. She's like got blood, coming out of her mouth. I don't know. So Putin's like, wait a second, we had an election, the pro-Russian guy wins, and you stage a coup, de facto coup, and kick him out and put in a puppet. So what does Putin do next? He invades Crimea, or annexes Crimea, takes it over. So it's like, okay, Georgia should join NATO. He invades Georgia. Ukraine should join NATO. We just had a coup. He takes over Ukraine. Are you not paying attention? You, meaning the West, US, UK, are you not paying attention to what's going on here? And then they sponsored, anyway, without getting, they sponsored attacks on the Russian-speaking part of Ukraine, et cetera. So by 2022, Putin's at the end of his rope. Now, yes, he did invade. Of course he did, and no, there's no disputing that. But it was the Minsk Accords, which were balanced, I would say. They gave Donbass some autonomy in exchange for neutrality, and Ukraine would not join NATO, et cetera. But Angela Merkel was later quoted as saying that was always a joke. We never intended to honor them. And Putin's feeling like a sucker at this point, which he kind of was. So in other words, how many times can you poke the tiger in the eye before the tiger strikes? And that's the question. So yeah, Russia invaded, I get it, but it was 14 years of provocation. And now they're playing for keeps. But the U.S. wanted this war because they were, and they are, delusional. They're like, yeah, bring it on, because Russia will be depleted. They'll get killed. They'll use up their armaments. They'll deplete their arsenals, their inventories. They'll spend a lot of money. We'll throw sanctions on them like crazy. They'll go broke. The Russians, there'll be unrest in Russia. We'll get rid of Moscow, or sorry, we'll get rid of Putin, and we'll go all the way to Moscow and put Russia back where they were in the 90s with Boris Yeltsin and a bottle of vodka before breakfast. None of that has played out. Everything I just said, that was the goal. And they say so. Again, I'm not breaking into safes in Washington. They say these things. But every one of them has turned out to be the opposite. Here's what's actually happening. Number one, World Bank, not exactly a Russian puppet. They're pretty much controlled by the U.S., projects Russian growth this year at 0.7%, but it's been revised upward. Now go back to early 2022. What were they saying? Russian economy is going to collapse. It's the end of the ruble. Biden is like, we're going to bury the ruble. No, the ruble did dip from 70 to 140 for about a minute, and then it got back to 70, and then it got too strong. It was 50 to 1, whereas at the beginning of the war it was 70 to 1. Elvira Nabiullina, who's the head of the Central Bank of Russia, for my money, the only central banker who actually understands her job, actually had to cut interest rates, not raise them, but cut them, because she was worried the ruble was getting too strong. And today it's around 70, which is what it was where the war began. So the ruble is unchanged in a year and a half. So the ruble is doing fine. The Russian economy is growing. Will probably outperform the U.S. economy this year. We'll see how it plays out, but I expect a recession in the U.S., no recession in Russia. Their foreign exchange reserves are up because they're selling more oil than ever at higher prices. And inflation is totally under control. So the Russian economy is, if not thriving, it's doing pretty well, and it's doing. Germany's in recession, Japan's in recession, the EU just went into a technical recession. The US is headed that way, may already be, and the Russian economy is growing without inflation. So much for burying Russia's economy. But beyond that, Putin put the whole economy on a war footing. I mean, I studied World War II. Victor Davis Hanson has a great book called The Second World Wars, plural. But he has like 2 pages on Stalingrad and a page and a half on D-Day. The whole book, because there were thousands of books written on all those subjects, his book is about industrial production behind the war effort and how Henry Ford turned assembly lines from Fords to B-29s almost overnight, and how the Wehrmacht, they were the most lethal force in World War II. They would kill 2 or 3 Russians to 1 German on the Eastern Front, except Stalin, he'd kill 3 million, and Stalin would send 3 million more and 5 million more. And finally, at a certain point, the German general said, wait a second, we're in over our heads here. We can't, we can keep killing them, but they keep coming. But between Lend-Lease and being on a war footing, they just outproduced Germany. 15,000 bombers a month versus 3 or 4 that Albert Speer could produce. Well, the same thing's going on today. Putin put his economy on a war footing. We did not. And so we're the ones seeing the arsenals depleted. The British are sending the Shadow, I forget the exact name, Shadow missile. The U.S. is sending Patriot missile batteries. Guess what? The Patriots don't work against the Russian Iskal hypersonic missile. They can shoot down cruise missiles. That's what they were designed for. But the Russians aren't shooting cruise missiles. They're shooting hypersonic missiles, and they're blowing up the Patriots. So the other day, Zelensky said, we need more Patriots. Yeah, that's because we sent you 3, large batteries, or $1 billion a piece, and one of them's destroyed, and the other 2 are on the way to being destroyed. I saw a burning Leopard tank the other day. This is the Leopard 2, Germany's state-of-the-art tank, the new, Panzer division, whatever. They're getting blown up by the Russians. The British missile and the U.S. drone, the HIMARS, the mobile long-range artillery. It's really more like a missile battery, but it looks like a big artillery gun. The Russians figured out how to disable the GPS. It's sort of like, I think it was a cruise missile fired from a cannon, very potent, except if you disable the GPS, the shell doesn't know where it's going, and they're landing harmlessly. They're getting blown up. So, and the F-16 won't be any different. The war may be over before that. So the point is, so then Zelensky's begging for ammunition. The Ukrainian offensive just started about a week ago. It's failing badly. Casualties are high. This armor I talked about is being blown up. Most of the Ukrainian armor are old Russian tanks. I think the T-62. They're getting blown up. They're in open fields, and they don't have any air cover, and the Russians are destroying them. And so all these so-called miracle weapons don't work. So what is Zelensky begging for now? Ammunition. It's not even, what good is a high-tech cannon if you don't have any shells? And the U.S. has provided this. The U.S. is begging South Korea, hey, could you send them some ammo? And South Korea is like, well, we'll ship it to Poland and maybe they can do it. We want to keep our hands clean. But some of this is coming from South Korea. The Poles are out. The Brits are out. The Americans are out. It's like, oh, well, wait a second. Whose economy is suffering? Whose arsenals are being depleted? Who's spending all the money? Who's bankrupting their own economy? It's the United States and our allies, not the Russians. So everyone says, well, let's call up the factory and order some more ammo. No, we shut down those assembly lines a long time ago, and we're depleting our arsenals. You know how long it takes to retool a factory to start producing stuff once you've shut it down? The answer is about 2 years. So this war will be over. So sorry to be kind of go on, but the point is every single goal or metric that the U.S. set has not come true for the Russians and has come true for the U.S. We're the ones being depleted. We're the ones spending the money. We're the ones failing. The Ukrainians sadly are suffering the casualties, like over 200,000 at this point. Russia's got a secure hold on the so-called land bridge from Rostov-on-Don to Crimea. They got their eye on Odessa. They've had a year to build major fortifications. The Ukrainian advance, which they're losing. I mean, they're basically attacking and getting beaten back by the Russians. Those are the outer perimeter. That's the Russian perimeter. That's relatively lightly stocked compared to the much stronger fortifications. The Ukrainians haven't even gotten through them, and this is like Pickett's charge, at Gettysburg, where Lee had a success at Chancellorsville not too many months before Gettysburg, where he just charged and he broke through the Union lines and disrupted it and won the battle, etc. And they were going to do a replay with Pickett's charge, except the Union line held. The Confederates were beaten back and they retreated, and that was the beginning of the end of the Confederate war effort. And then the rest is history, as they say. So that's kind of what's happening to Ukraine right now. But the U.S. won't quit. And so now they want the F-16s, which won't be any different. They'll just get shot down. And so then he said, where does it end? And as you see, this guy Cimarella, he's Eric Cimarella. He's wrote an article. He was the rat in the Trump impeachment. Remember the phone call with Zelensky, as if, how many times, Biden's been to Kiev talking to Zelensky, but Trump makes one phone call and he gets impeached. But the guy who got the transcript of the call from Vindman and delivered it to Adam Schiff and routed out Trump and started the whole impeachment thing. It was in the National Intelligence Council. I used to work there. And it's like a big brain wing of the CIA. He was the rat. Well, he just wrote an article. It's now at the Carnegie Endowment. Where else, right? And they're going to the Korean model. They're saying, well, okay, we're clearly losing, but let's not lose. Let's have like an armistice. By the way, the Korean War is not over. What they did in 1953, they had an armistice. They stopped shooting and had a line of control, DMZ. But there's never been a peace treaty. And technically, North and South Korea are still at war. But what they want is an armistice in Ukraine, stop the fighting, here's the line, and we'll figure it out, which would basically be an opportunity to rest and rearm Ukraine before the warmongers start the war again. Why would Russia agree to that? I mean, Russia's winning. Why would you agree to an armistice? I mean, that's how World War I ended before the Versailles Treaty. So I just see people who are delusional, who don't understand the economic side of war, which is a big deal. Think you can push a button and get weapons, and you can't. It takes years to retool those assembly lines. Think money's unlimited, and it's not. And have this just irrational. We're talking about Fiona Hill, George Kent, Victoria Nuland, Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan. These people are political hacks. They're not that bright, and Biden's feeble-minded, and that's who's running U.S. policy.
Wow. I love how you break that down. I got a couple more questions about Ukraine. You alluded to the fact that you're going to talk a little bit about what you're calling the most significant development in international finance since 1971. It's an upcoming geopolitical shockwave. I do want to get to that, but also you have made a video about that people can go watch right now, including how they can position themselves to profit. It's at londonreal.tv/Jim. I highly recommend everyone watch this right when we're finished. Recently, I've watched interviews with both RFK and Trump who said they will end the war immediately. Like one phone call, it's over in a week. And fascinatingly, both saying kind of a similar thing. And quite frankly, Jim, I believe them both. I believe they could actually do it and they will do it. You've watched both of those two men kind of campaigning. It's a very, very fascinating race with both of them in there. I'm kind of looking for a Trump Kennedy ticket maybe at the end of it, but that's another story. Talk to me about what they're saying. Could it be done? And what do you make of those candidates right now?
Well, first of all, I find both of them intriguing. Trump's, better known when he was president, but RFK is not exactly, the Kennedy name is not exactly unknown. I mean, I'll go back to the first election I could vote in was 1972, because at the time the voting age was 21 years old. But in 1968, as a high schooler with no money, a friend of mine and I hitchhiked from Cape May, New Jersey to Camden, New Jersey, a distance of about 80 miles, to hear his father, Robert F. Kennedy, speak. And so, like I said, I'm a 16, 17-year-old hitchhiking to hear RFK. That's how inspired I was by what he was doing at the time.
Wow. How was the speech?
The answer is sure. Sorry, go ahead.
How was the speech? Do you remember?
Oh, it was great. I mean, he's inspiring, and he kind of, he came out of nowhere in the primary because Lyndon Johnson was running for president and Eugene McCarthy was holding his own in New Hampshire, and it was only at that point that RFK jumped in. But that's okay. You gotta pick your spots. Yeah, I've been on that bandwagon for a long time, but RFK Jr. First of all, sorry, the short answer to your question is yes. You could end it with a phone call. This is a war that never should have started. Okay, you could have stopped it with a phone call. Say, hey, okay, Putin, here's the deal. Ukraine's neutral; they're not joining NATO. Autonomy for the Donbass. Stop killing the Russian-speaking part of the population, and maybe a few other bells and whistles, some security guarantees from EU or NATO, and then that's it. Sign that deal and just go forward and let the politics take its course. So it never should have started. Okay, so then it starts. You could have ended it with a phone call just by saying, okay, got it, you're serious. I should have known that from the start. We'll do the same deal with one big difference, which is Russia will not give up the territory they've taken. They've spent too much money and blood to get there. So you want neutrality, you want no NATO membership, yeah, but we're keeping what we took. Because I always explain, there's so many sort of anti-Semites or anti-Israeli people, you find them in the United States, I'm sure elsewhere, these Palestinians. I keep explaining to them, I said, the Arabs invaded Israel 4 times and Israel won all 4 wars. When you win wars, you get to keep stuff. I mean, that's what war is about. Okay. Oh, get out of the West Bank. Well, no, they fought 4 wars. They won all. They're 4-0. The 2006 Hezbollah thing, you can call that a tie if you want. But 1948, 1967, 1973, and the Intifada, they won, and so they get to keep stuff. Well, Russia won, and they're going to keep stuff. That's the difference between pre-war and where we are now. And yes, you could do that deal with a phone call. You just tell Zelensky, you're signing this deal, and we'll let you keep what's left, but that's it. And if you don't, you're gone. So they're right about that. Interesting that Kennedy's a liberal Democrat and Trump's a MAGA Republican, and they think the same thing. That's because they have a certain measure of common sense. But just again, not to get too in the weeds, but I'm coming to you. From New Hampshire in the United States. We have the first primary, and there's a footnote there. So historically, New Hampshire is the first primary in the country. It's a bellwether. It's where Eugene McCarthy, by the way, in 1968, he did not win the New Hampshire primary, but he got way more votes than anyone thought. And that led immediately to Lyndon Johnson withdrawing from the race, and then RFK jumped in. But that was the sequence. McCarthy didn't win the New Hampshire primary, but he got like 40% of the vote against a sitting president. That was a shock. Who running for a second term? That was a shock. So, so that's kind of the reputation of New Hampshire. Now, what happened in 2020? Biden finished 5th in the New Hampshire primary. 5th. He slumped out of town. He was written off by the media. Okay, he's done. Let's look at Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Amy Klobuchar. They were the people who finished ahead of Biden in the New Hampshire primary. What happened next? Well, the next primary is South Carolina, which is about 50-50 Republican-Democrat. But if you take the 50% Democrat, that's about 80% African-American. And their boss, their leader, is James Clyburn, who was the number 3 ranking Democrat in the House in the Nancy Pelosi days. And he was going to steer that whole state to Biden because the Democrats were scared to death that Bernie Sanders was going to be the nominee, and he was ahead at that point. So yeah, we got to flip this to Biden. We don't want Elizabeth Warren; she's nuts. So, but they had to get everyone else out of the way. So the phone calls were made. What happened the day or two before the South Carolina primary? Amy Klobuchar dropped out. Pete Buttigieg dropped out. I think Elizabeth Warren hung on for a few more days, but then she dropped out. Clyburn delivers the South Carolina Democrats to Biden. Biden wins the South Carolina primary after finishing 5th in New Hampshire, and the rest is history. He goes, and Sanders dropped out a few weeks later, and Biden becomes the nominee. So about 6 or 7 months ago, the Democratic National Committee says, well, we're going to change the primary calendar. We're going to say South Carolina goes first. Oh, no kidding. So that's a slam dunk for Biden. They don't want Biden to run in New Hampshire because he's like a sitting president running for re-election, and he might not win, or at least he might be Lyndon Johnson win, but not by enough votes. What they didn't seem to understand is that New Hampshire's status as the first primary state is a state statute. It has nothing to do with the Democratic National Committee or anything else. And again, here in New Hampshire, we have a Republican governor, and both houses of the state legislature are Republican controlled. So they're kind of looking at the DNC. We don't care what you say. We're going to have our primary when we have it. Now, if your guy doesn't want to run, that's up to him. But RFK Jr. says, I'm getting to the point here. RFK Jr. has said, I'm definitely running in the New Hampshire primary. My path to the nomination starts in New Hampshire. So now you've got this awful conundrum for the Biden people. It's like, oh, do we blow off New Hampshire? Well, how does that play out in the general election? You know, it comes down to a couple of votes. New Hampshire's got 3 electoral votes. It's not a lot, but if we're the difference, you know, you've alienated everyone in New Hampshire. How does that look? If you're running for president, you won't run in a primary.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.
So Jim Rickards has just recorded a video that's not available to anyone in the public, and he's going to be talking about how this upcoming recession is going to be fast, it's going to be bloody, it's going to be nasty. But at the same time, he's going to show you how you can position yourself to profit from all of this chaos. Now, we've made this video only available to our viewers. Go to londonreal.tv/Jim. Watch that immediately. I can't say enough good things about Jim Rickards. He understands the global economic system better than any guest I've ever had on London Real. His predictions are almost uncannily true, and you can learn how to profit from his vision, from his expertise, and his understanding of economics. So go to londonreal.tv/Jim or click the link below. It's an excellent, excellent look on what's going to happen in the future and how you can position yourself to profit from that. Jim is one of the best in the business, one of my favorite guests on London Real, and he's very, very good at predicting the future and showing us all to profit from it. So click the link, and I hope you enjoy. Hey, it's Brian Rose, founder of the DeFi Academy. I've told you my 4-week crypto bootcamp is amazing, but don't take my word for it. This is what my students are saying.
The DeFi Academy was an amazing experience for me. It took me totally out of my comfort zone.
In this course, I was challenged, I was held accountable, and pushed to do things that honestly weren't always easy.
It's been phenomenal, and I can't believe we're already up on our 4 weeks. It has flown by.
Going through this DeFi accelerator by far was one of the best courses I've taken.
You do this course, you really get into the nitty-gritty of the activities that will make you comfortable with decentralized finance.
Thank you so much to Brian and everyone at London Real and the DeFi Academy for even putting together an amazing course like this.
Anybody else that wants to do it, please sign up. It is well worth the money.